Toronto today stands as one of North America's most dynamic metropolises, home to nearly 3 million people in the city proper and over 6 million in the greater metropolitan area. But beneath the gleaming towers of Bay Street and the bustling neighbourhoods that stretch endlessly in every direction lies a story of transformation that spans centuries. Tonight, we'll uncover how a modest fur trading post evolved into Canada's economic powerhouse, a city that has weathered wars, economic upheavals, waves of immigration, and countless challenges to emerge as one of the world's truly global cities. We'll begin with an unexpected discovery made during construction work in downtown Toronto, and from there, we'll trace the remarkable journey of this city through its many incarnations. So just relax and let your mind wander as we explore the fascinating evolution of Toronto. When you think of Toronto, perhaps you picture the iconic CN Tower piercing the skyline, the financial district with its canyon of glass and steel, or the vibrant neighbourhoods like Kensington Market and Queen Street West. This city feels thoroughly modern, a place where innovation and tradition blend seamlessly. And indeed, with its position as Canada's largest city and economic engine, Toronto has earned its place among the world's great urban centres. You can sense the energy here, the constant movement of people and commerce that defines a truly international city. But step back from the contemporary bustle, and you'll find layers of history that tell a much different story. The gleaming office towers and trendy condominiums are relatively recent additions to a landscape that has seen centuries of continuous human habitation and dramatic change. In the 1980s, during excavation work for a new building project near the waterfront, construction crews made a remarkable discovery. Buried beneath layers of modern Toronto were the remnants of ancient settlements, artifacts that spoke to a history far older than the European colonization that most people associate with the city's origins. Stone tools, pottery fragments, and evidence of long-term habitation revealed that this area had been home to Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. It's fascinating to imagine that here, where subway trains now rumble beneath busy streets, Indigenous communities once thrived along the shores of Lake Ontario. However, the true story of Toronto as we know it begins with these original inhabitants and their deep connection to this particular stretch of land. Indigenous peoples had been living in the Toronto area for millennia before the first European explorers arrived. The region was particularly attractive due to its strategic location along several important waterways and trade routes. Lake Ontario provided abundant fish and served as a natural highway for canoe travel, while the rivers and streams that flowed into it offered access to the interior of the continent. The area was part of the traditional territory of several Indigenous nations, most notably the Haudenosaunee and later the Anishinaabe peoples. These communities had developed sophisticated systems of governance, agriculture, and trade that connected them with other Indigenous nations across vast distances. They cultivated corn, beans, and squash, hunted game in the surrounding forests, and established seasonal camps that took advantage of the area's natural resources. The name Toronto itself reflects this Indigenous heritage. Most scholars believe it derives from the Mohawk word Takaronto, which referred to a place where trees stand in the water. This likely described the fish weirs that Indigenous peoples constructed in the rivers and streams, wooden structures that would have appeared as trees standing in the flowing water. These weirs were ingenious devices that allowed communities to harvest fish efficiently during seasonal runs. By the time European explorers began venturing into the Great Lakes region in the 17th century, the Toronto area was already a well-established hub of Indigenous activity. The location offered something that would prove consistently valuable throughout the city's history. It was a natural meeting place, a crossroads where different communities and trade networks intersected. The first documented European to reach the Toronto area was the French explorer Étienne Brulé, who arrived sometime around 1615. Brûlé was part of the broader French exploration and colonization effort that was spreading throughout what is now eastern Canada. He travelled with Indigenous guides who were already familiar with the extensive network of waterways and portage routes that connected the Great Lakes to the St. Lawrence River system. For the French, the Toronto area represented something quite different from what it meant to Indigenous peoples. While Indigenous communities saw it as part of their traditional territory and a place for seasonal activities, the French viewed it primarily through the lens of the fur trade. This was the economic engine that drove French colonization efforts throughout much of North America during the 17th and early 18th centuries. The French established a trading post in the area around 1720, recognizing its strategic importance for controlling access to the upper Great Lakes region. They called it Fort Rouillé, named after Antoine-Louis Rouillé, the French colonial minister. The fort was relatively modest, consisting of a wooden stockade and several buildings that served as storage facilities and living quarters for the small garrison of soldiers and traders stationed there. Fort Rouillé occupied a site near the mouth of the Humber River, taking advantage of the natural harbour that Lake Ontario provided. The location was chosen carefully as it allowed the French to monitor and control the movement of furs and other trade goods between the interior of the continent and the established French settlements along the St. Lawrence River. However, the French presence in the Toronto area remained relatively limited during this period. The fort was more of an outpost than a permanent settlement, and its population rarely exceeded a few dozen people. The French were primarily interested in maintaining their trading relationships with Indigenous partners and ensuring that valuable furs continued to flow toward their established colonies rather than toward competing British trading posts. This would prove to be a critical limitation as tensions between France and Britain escalated throughout the mid-18th century. The competition between these two European powers was playing out across multiple continents, and North America became one of the key theatres of conflict. What began as economic rivalry increasingly took on military dimensions as both nations sought to secure their territorial claims and trading advantages. The 7 Years' War, which raged from 1756 to 1763, fundamentally altered the political landscape of North America. In the Toronto area, the conflict had immediate and lasting consequences. As British forces advanced into French-controlled territory, the small garrison at Fort Rouillé found itself in an increasingly precarious position. In 1759, faced with the prospect of capture by advancing British forces, the French garrison at Fort Rouillé made the decision to abandon and destroy the fort, rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands. They burned the buildings and withdrew, effectively ending the French period of control over the Toronto area. This destruction marked the end of one era and set the stage for a completely different chapter in the region's development. The British victory in the 7 Years' War brought all of New France under British control, including the strategically important Toronto area. However, the British approach to this territory differed significantly from that of their French predecessors. While the French had been primarily interested in the fur trade and maintaining relationships with Indigenous partners, the British had broader ambitions for territorial development and permanent settlement. Initially, the British showed little immediate interest in developing the Toronto area. The region was included in the vast territory designated as the Indian Reserve under the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which theoretically protected Indigenous lands from European settlement. In practice, however, this arrangement was always viewed as temporary by British colonial administrators who anticipated eventual expansion into these territories. The American Revolution, which began in the 1770s, created new pressures and opportunities that would reshape the Toronto area's future. As the conflict progressed, thousands of colonists who remained loyal to the British Crown found themselves in increasingly difficult circumstances. These loyalists, as they came to be known, faced persecution, property confiscation, and sometimes violence from their revolutionary neighbours. British officials recognised that they had an obligation to provide refuge and compensation for these loyal subjects who had sacrificed so much for the imperial cause. At the same time, they saw an opportunity to strengthen British North America by establishing settlements of proven loyal subjects in strategic locations. The Toronto area, with its excellent natural harbour and strategic position on Lake Ontario, emerged as an ideal location for such a settlement. The process of establishing British control over the Toronto area required negotiations with the Indigenous nations who had traditional claims to the territory. In 1787, British officials concluded the Toronto Purchase, a treaty with the Mississaugas of the Credit River that ostensibly transferred ownership of a large tract of land around Toronto Bay to the British Crown. This transaction, like many such treaties of the period, was problematic from the start. The concept of land ownership, as understood by British law, differed fundamentally from Indigenous concepts of territorial stewardship and shared use rights. The compensation offered to the Mississaugas was minimal, consisting of some trade goods valued at roughly 10 shillings. Even by the standards of the time, this was an extraordinarily small payment for such valuable territory. Moreover, there were significant misunderstandings about what exactly was being transferred. The Indigenous signatories may have believed they were granting permission for shared use of the territory rather than permanently surrendering all rights to it. These ambiguities would create ongoing disputes and grievances that persisted for generations. With the legal framework in place, British officials began planning for the establishment of a permanent settlement in the Toronto area. The man chosen to lead this effort was John Graves Simcoe, a veteran military officer who had served with distinction during the American Revolution. In 1791, Simcoe was appointed as the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, the new British province that encompassed much of present-day Ontario. Simcoe was an ambitious and energetic leader who envisioned Upper Canada as a model British colony that would demonstrate the superiority of British institutions and values. He believed that the new province could serve as both a refuge for loyalist refugees and a bulwark against potential American expansion. The establishment of a strong settlement at Toronto was central to this vision. In 1793, Simcoe arrived at Toronto Bay with a small party of officials, soldiers, and surveyors. He immediately set about establishing the basic infrastructure for what he initially called York, naming the new settlement in honour of the Duke of York. The choice of this location was driven by several practical considerations that would prove prescient over the coming decades. The natural harbour provided excellent protection for ships and boats, while the relatively flat terrain made it easier to establish streets and buildings. The site also offered access to several rivers that could facilitate transportation and trade with the interior regions. Perhaps most importantly, the location was far enough from the American border to provide security, yet close enough to maintain communication and supply lines with other British settlements. Simcoe's vision for York extended far beyond simply creating another trading post or military outpost. He imagined a proper town that would serve as the capital of Upper Canada, complete with government buildings, churches, schools, and residential neighbourhoods that would attract respectable British settlers. This was to be a showcase of British civilization in the North American wilderness. The early days of York were challenging in ways that tested even Simcoe's considerable optimism. The small band of settlers faced the enormous task of clearing dense forests, draining marshy areas, and constructing basic shelter before the harsh Canadian winter set in. Many of the loyalist families who formed the core of the early population had already endured years of hardship and displacement, and starting over yet again in an undeveloped wilderness required tremendous resilience. The town's layout reflected both practical necessities and Simcoe's grand ambitions. The main settlement was established on the north shore of the bay, with a grid pattern of streets that could accommodate future growth. King Street ran east and west, parallel to the waterfront, while Yonge Street extended northward into the interior. These thoroughfares were more aspirational than functional in the early years, often little more than muddy tracks through the forest. Fort York was constructed on a peninsula that jutted into the harbour, providing a defensive position that could control access to the town and its port facilities. The fort's earthworks and wooden palisades were modest compared to major military installations elsewhere, but they represented a tangible symbol of British authority and offered some protection against potential threats. Life in early York was characterised by a constant struggle against the elements and isolation. Supplies had to be brought in by ship during the navigation season or by dangerous overland routes through forests and swamps. Communication with other settlements was sporadic, and news from the outside world could take weeks or months to arrive. During the long winters, the small community was largely cut off from the rest of the world. Despite these challenges, York began to attract a steady stream of new residents. Some were loyalist refugees seeking a fresh start under British rule, while others were recent immigrants from Britain who were drawn by offers of free land and the promise of opportunity in a new country. The population remained small during the 1790s, probably no more than a few hundred people, but it was growing steadily. The economic foundation of early York rested primarily on government spending and the fur trade. As the provincial capital, the town benefited from the presence of government officials, military personnel, and the various services they required. The fur trade, while less central than it had been during the French period, still generated significant economic activity as merchants and traders used York as a base for their operations. Agriculture also began to play an increasingly important role as settlers cleared land and established farms in the surrounding area. The fertile soil around York proved well suited for growing wheat, and this crop would eventually become a major export commodity. However, developing a successful agricultural economy required time, as land had to be cleared, roads built, and markets established. The social structure of early York reflected both the egalitarian possibilities of frontier life and the hierarchical assumptions that settlers brought with them from Britain. Government officials, military officers, and successful merchants formed a small but influential elite that dominated the town's political and economic life. Below them were smaller merchants, skilled craftsmen, and farmers who made up the emerging middle class. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were labourers, servants, and the small number of enslaved people who had been brought to Upper Canada by their loyalist masters. Slavery was legal in the province, though Lieutenant Governor Simcoe had introduced legislation that would gradually phase it out over time. The presence of enslaved people in early York is often overlooked, but it was a reality that shaped the experiences of both the enslaved individuals and the broader community. The town's physical development proceeded slowly but steadily throughout the 1790s and early 1800s. The first substantial buildings were government structures, including a courthouse, jail, and legislative assembly building. These were followed by churches, schools, and commercial establishments that served the growing population. Most buildings were constructed of wood, which was abundant and relatively inexpensive, though this material choice would later prove problematic during several devastating fires. The waterfront became the commercial heart of the community, with wharves, warehouses, and shops clustered near the harbour. Ships arriving from other Great Lakes ports brought manufactured goods, supplies, and passengers, while departing vessels carried local products like lumber, furs, and increasingly agricultural produce to markets in Montreal and beyond. York's role as the provincial capital brought both advantages and complications. On the positive side, the presence of government institutions provided economic stability and attracted educated, influential residents who contributed to the town's cultural and intellectual life. The provincial parliament met in York, bringing together representatives from across Upper Canada and focusing attention on the growing settlement. However, the town's political prominence also made it a target during times of conflict. This vulnerability became dramatically apparent during the War of 1812, when York found itself on the front lines of a conflict that would test the survival of British North America itself. The War of 1812 erupted due to escalating tensions between Britain and the United States over trade restrictions, naval impressment, and territorial ambitions. For the residents of York, the conflict was not some distant diplomatic dispute, but an immediate threat to their homes, businesses, and way of life. The town's strategic location on Lake Ontario made it an obvious military target for American forces seeking to disrupt British supply lines and communications. In April 1813, these fears became reality when a large American naval and military force appeared in Toronto Bay. The attacking force consisted of 14 ships carrying over 1,700 troops under the command of General Henry Dearborn and Commodore Isaac Chauncey. This was a formidable force, far larger than anything the modest defences of York could hope to repel. The British garrison at Fort York, commanded by General Roger Sheaffe, numbered only a few hundred regular soldiers and militia. Recognizing that the town could not be successfully defended against such overwhelming odds, Sheaffe made the difficult decision to conduct a fighting withdrawal. As American forces landed and began advancing toward the fort, the British attempted to destroy military supplies and installations to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The most dramatic moment of the battle came when the British detonated the fort's powder magazine as they retreated. The massive explosion killed and wounded many American soldiers, including General Zebulon Pike, one of the expedition's commanders. The blast also sent debris flying across a wide area, damaging buildings throughout the town and creating a scene of devastation that shocked both sides. American forces occupied York for 6 days, during which time they systematically destroyed government buildings, military installations, and public property. The provincial parliament building, courthouse, and other symbols of British authority were burned, along with the contents of the public library and other cultural institutions. Private property was also looted, though American officers made some efforts to prevent the worst excesses. The burning of York had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate destruction. The attack hardened attitudes on both sides and contributed to a cycle of retaliation that characterized much of the War of 1812. More immediately, it left the residents of York to rebuild their community while the war continued to rage around them. Recovery from the American attack was slow and difficult. The provincial government had to operate from temporary quarters, while new buildings were constructed to replace those that had been destroyed. Many residents had lost homes, businesses, and personal possessions, and the local economy was severely disrupted. Insurance was virtually unknown at the time, so most losses had to be absorbed individually. Despite these setbacks, the people of York demonstrated remarkable resilience in rebuilding their community. Within a few years, new government buildings had been constructed, and the town was functioning normally again. The experience of surviving the attack and rebuilding afterward seemed to strengthen the community's sense of identity and determination to succeed. The end of the War of 1812 marked the beginning of a new period of growth and development for York. The threat of American invasion had passed, and British North America had successfully defended its independence. This victory, though achieved at considerable cost, provided a foundation of confidence that would support future expansion and prosperity. Immigration to Upper Canada increased dramatically after 1815, as economic hardship and social unrest in Britain drove thousands of people to seek new opportunities in the colonies. Many of these immigrants passed through York or chose to settle in the surrounding area, contributing to rapid population growth. By 1820, The town's population had grown to over 1,200 people, and the surrounding countryside was filling up with farms and smaller settlements. Economic development accelerated as well, driven by both population growth and improved transportation links. The construction of better roads connecting York to other settlements made trade and communication easier, while the development of regular steamship service on Lake Ontario reduced the town's isolation. These improvements helped York establish itself as the commercial centre for a growing agricultural region. The agricultural transformation of the countryside around York was nothing short of remarkable during these years. Vast forests gave way to orderly fields of wheat, and what had once been wilderness began to resemble the familiar, rural landscapes that immigrants remembered from Britain. The success of these farming communities created a reliable market for goods and services in York, while the surplus grain they produced became an increasingly important export commodity. The town's merchants and entrepreneurs were quick to capitalise on these new opportunities. Flour mills, breweries and other processing facilities were established to add value to the raw agricultural products flowing into York from the surrounding countryside. Banking and financial services began to emerge as successful farmers and merchants accumulated capital that needed to be invested and managed. These developments marked the beginning of York's transformation from a frontier settlement into a genuine commercial centre. The social fabric of York was also evolving rapidly during this period. The small intimate community of the early years was giving way to a more complex and stratified society. Wealthy merchants and professionals began to build substantial homes that reflected their prosperity and social status, while working-class neighbourhoods developed around the industrial areas near the waterfront. This growing inequality was not unique to York, but it represented a significant change from the more egalitarian conditions of the frontier period. Cultural institutions began to flourish as the town's population grew larger and more prosperous. Newspapers were established to serve the growing literate population, providing news, commentary, and a forum for public debate. Schools were founded to educate the children of both wealthy and middle-class families, while churches of various denominations were built to serve the spiritual needs of different immigrant communities. These institutions helped create a sense of civic identity and shared purpose that transcended the diverse origins of York's residents. The 1820s and 1830s witnessed increasingly sophisticated political debates about the future direction of the province and the role that York should play in shaping that future. Many residents were becoming frustrated with the concentration of power in the hands of a small group of well-connected families, often referred to as the family compact. These critics argued for more democratic institutions and greater local control over government decisions that affected their daily lives. Political tensions came to a head during the Rebellion of 1837, when frustrated reformers, led by William Lyon Mackenzie, attempted to overthrow the provincial government by force. The rebellion was centred in York, where Mackenzie and his followers planned to seize control of government buildings and establish a new, more democratic system of government. However, the uprising was poorly organised and quickly collapsed when government forces rallied to defend the existing order. The failure of the rebellion had significant consequences for York and the broader province. Many of the rebel leaders were forced to flee to the United States, while others were imprisoned or executed. The political crisis led to a period of soul-searching about the future of British North America and ultimately contributed to the constitutional reforms that would create the province of Canada in 1841. Despite the political upheaval, York continued to grow and prosper throughout the 1830s. The town's population approached 10,000 by the end of the decade, making it by far the largest urban centre in Upper Canada. This growth was accompanied by significant improvements in infrastructure and public services. Gas lighting was introduced to illuminate the main streets, while a more reliable water supply system was developed to serve the growing population. Transportation improvements were particularly important during this period. The construction of better roads and the introduction of regular stagecoach services made it easier to travel to and from York, while the development of steamship services on Lake Ontario connected the town to a broader network of commercial and cultural exchanges. These improvements reduced York's isolation and helped integrate it into the expanding economy of British North America. The 1830s also saw the beginning of serious discussions about railway construction, a technology that promised to revolutionize transportation and commerce throughout North America. York's merchants and civic leaders recognized that the town's future prosperity would depend on securing good railway connections to other major centres. These early railway debates set the stage for the massive construction projects that would transform York in the following decades. In 1834, York officially became the City of Toronto, taking back the Indigenous name that had been set aside when the settlement was first established. This change was more than symbolic, as it reflected the community's growing confidence and sense of identity as a distinctly North American city, rather than simply an outpost of British civilization. The new name also acknowledged, however indirectly, the deep Indigenous roots of the area. The incorporation as a city brought new governmental structures and expanded municipal powers that allowed Toronto to address the challenges of rapid urban growth more effectively. The first mayor, William Lyon Mackenzie, was the same man who would later lead the failed rebellion of 1837. His election reflected the democratic aspirations of many Toronto residents, even though his later political activities would end in failure. Toronto's new civic status coincided with a period of remarkable economic expansion that established the city as the undisputed commercial centre of Upper Canada. The completion of the Welland Canal in the 1820s had made it possible for ships to bypass Niagara Falls and travel directly between Lake Ontario and the Upper Great Lakes. This development dramatically increased Toronto's importance as a port and commercial hub, as goods flowing between the American Midwest and the Atlantic markets increasingly passed through the city's harbour. The construction of major roads radiating out from Toronto further enhanced the city's position as a transportation hub. Yonge Street, which had been little more than a rough trail in the early years, was improved and extended northward, eventually reaching Lake Simcoe and beyond. Other roads connected Toronto to Hamilton, Kingston, and other important centres, creating a network that channeled trade and travel through the growing city. Banking and finance emerged as increasingly important sectors of Toronto's economy during the 1830s and 1840s. The Bank of Toronto, established in 1834, was one of several financial institutions that provided credit and investment capital for the city's expanding commercial activities. These banks not only served local needs, but also began to extend their operations throughout Upper Canada, making Toronto the financial centre of the province. Manufacturing also began to play a larger role in Toronto's economy, as entrepreneurs recognised the opportunities created by the city's growing population and improving transportation links. Foundries, machine shops, and other industrial establishments were built near the waterfront, taking advantage of water transportation for both raw materials and finished products. These early industries were modest compared to what would come later, but they represented the beginning of Toronto's transformation into a major industrial centre. The social character of Toronto continued to evolve as the city grew larger and more diverse. Immigration from Britain remained strong throughout this period, with Irish immigrants forming a particularly large and visible community. The Irish population included both Protestant and Catholic settlers, and religious tensions sometimes spilled over into social and political conflicts that reflected broader patterns of discrimination and prejudice. Despite these challenges, Toronto was developing a reputation as a place of opportunity where hard work and talent could lead to success regardless of one's origins. The city's newspapers regularly featured stories of immigrants who had arrived with little money but had built successful businesses or professional careers through determination and enterprise. These success stories helped attract more immigrants and contributed to Toronto's image as a dynamic, forward-looking community. Education became an increasingly important priority as Toronto's population grew more prosperous and sophisticated. Private schools catered to the children of wealthy families, while public education began to expand to serve the broader population. The establishment of King's College in 1827, which would later become the University of Toronto, marked the beginning of higher education in the city and reflected the community's commitment to intellectual and cultural development. Religious life in Toronto was characterized by both diversity and occasional conflict, as different denominations competed for influence and members. Anglican churches enjoyed official status and government support, while Methodist, Presbyterian, and Catholic congregations had to rely on their own resources. Despite these tensions, the various religious communities contributed significantly to the city's educational and charitable institutions. The 1840s brought new challenges and opportunities as political changes transformed the governmental structure of British North America. The union of Upper and Lower Canada into the Province of Canada in 1841 created a larger political unit with new economic possibilities, but it also meant that Toronto had to compete with Montreal and Quebec City for political influence and government spending. The railway age began in earnest during the 1850s, fundamentally altering Toronto's relationship with the rest of North America. The construction of the Great Western Railway, which connected Toronto to Hamilton and eventually to the American railway system, opened up vast new markets for Toronto's merchants and manufacturers. The Northern Railway, completed in the same period, provided access to the resource-rich regions north of Lake Simcoe and further enhanced Toronto's position as a transportation hub. These railway connections had profound effects on Toronto's development. The city's population grew rapidly as improved transportation made it easier for immigrants and migrants to reach Toronto, and as new economic opportunities attracted workers and entrepreneurs. By 1851, Toronto's population had reached nearly 31,000, making it one of the largest cities in British North America. The economic impact of the railways extended far beyond simple population growth. Toronto's merchants could now reach markets that had previously been inaccessible, while manufacturers gained access to raw materials and customers throughout a much wider region. The city's wholesale trade expanded dramatically as Toronto-based firms established networks that extended across much of central Canada and into the American Midwest. Banking and financial services grew even more important as Toronto's economy became more complex and far-reaching. The city's banks began to finance railway construction, industrial development, and commercial expansion throughout the region. This financial activity generated substantial profits that were reinvested in further development, creating a cycle of growth that accelerated Toronto's expansion. The physical appearance of Toronto changed dramatically during the 1850s as prosperity and growth transformed the cityscape. Substantial brick and stone buildings began to replace the wooden structures of earlier decades, giving the city a more permanent and impressive appearance. Gas lighting extended to more neighbourhoods, while improved water and sewage systems addressed some of the public health challenges created by rapid urban growth. The waterfront remained the commercial heart of the city, but it was increasingly crowded with warehouses, factories, and transportation facilities that served Toronto's expanding economy. The harbour was deepened and improved to accommodate larger ships, while new wharves and docking facilities were built to handle the growing volume of trade. These improvements helped maintain Toronto's competitive advantage as a port city, even as railway transportation became more important. Cultural life in Toronto flourished during this period of rapid growth and prosperity. The city's newspapers multiplied and became more sophisticated, providing coverage of local, national, and international news that kept Toronto residents connected to the broader world. Libraries, museums, and other cultural institutions were established or expanded, while theatres and music halls provided entertainment for the growing population. The establishment of the University of Toronto as a secular institution in 1850 marked an important milestone in the city's intellectual development. The university attracted students and faculty from across British North America and beyond, contributing to Toronto's reputation as a centre of learning and culture. The presence of the university also helped attract other professional and cultural institutions that enhanced the city's status as a regional centre. Despite this rapid progress, Toronto still faced significant challenges as the 1850s drew to a close. The city's growth had outpaced the development of adequate infrastructure in many areas, leading to problems with sanitation, transportation, and public services. Crime and social disorder were growing concerns as the population became larger and more diverse, while economic inequality created tensions between different social groups. The approaching crisis over the future of British North America would soon test Toronto's resilience once again. Political deadlock in the province of Canada, combined with external threats from the United States and internal pressures for constitutional reform, would require Toronto's leaders to help navigate their community through another period of fundamental change. The city that had begun as a modest colonial outpost was about to play a central role in the creation of a new nation. The question of what kind of nation British North America should become dominated political discussions throughout the 1850s and early 1860s, and Toronto found itself at the centre of these momentous debates. The city's newspapers, political leaders, and business community all recognised that the decisions made during this period would fundamentally shape the future of their community and the broader region. The American Civil War, which erupted in 1861, added urgency to these constitutional discussions. The conflict demonstrated the potential for catastrophic internal division, while the military mobilization of the Union forces raised concerns about American territorial ambitions once the war ended. Toronto's proximity to the American border made these fears particularly acute for the city's residents, who remembered the burning of their community during the War of 1812. At the same time, the deadlock between Upper and Lower Canada in the provincial legislature made effective governance increasingly difficult. Important legislation was regularly blocked by sectional interests, while essential public works projects were delayed or abandoned due to political manoeuvring. Toronto's business community, which depended on stable government policies to support continued economic growth, became increasingly frustrated with this paralysis. The solution that emerged from these various pressures was the ambitious plan for confederation that would unite the British North American colonies into a single nation. Toronto's political and business leaders played crucial roles in developing and promoting this proposal, recognizing that a larger political unit could provide both greater security and expanded economic opportunities. The Confederation negotiations, which took place in a series of conferences during 1864 and 1866, attracted enormous attention in Toronto. The city's newspapers provided detailed coverage of the proceedings, while public meetings and debates engaged citizens in discussions about the proposed new nation. Opinion was not unanimous, as some feared that Toronto's interests might be overshadowed by Montreal, or that the new federal system would prove unwieldy and expensive. However, the potential benefits of confederation were compelling for most Toronto residents. A transcontinental railway linking the Atlantic and Pacific coasts would open vast new markets, and opportunities, while the promise of Western expansion offered the prospect of unlimited growth. The new federal government would also be better positioned to defend British North America against external threats and to pursue ambitious development projects that were beyond the capacity of individual provinces. When Confederation became reality on July 1, 1867, Toronto celebrated alongside communities across the new Dominion of Canada. Church bells rang throughout the city, while parades and public festivities marked the historic occasion. The transformation from colonial outpost to major city in an independent nation represented the culmination of decades of struggle and development. The immediate impact of Confederation on Toronto was largely positive, as the city's strategic position and established commercial networks made it well suited to take advantage of the opportunities created by the larger domestic market. Toronto's banks began to extend their operations into the maritime provinces and westward toward the Red River, while the city's manufacturers found new customers for their products in previously inaccessible regions. The promise of a transcontinental railway was particularly important for Toronto's continued growth and development. The Canadian Pacific Railway, when completed, would make Toronto a crucial link between the industrial centres of central Canada and the resource-rich regions of the West. This prospect attracted additional investment and settlement to the city, as entrepreneurs and workers anticipated the economic boom that would accompany improved transportation links. Industrial development accelerated during the 1870s as Toronto's manufacturers took advantage of the larger Canadian market created by Confederation. The city's foundries and machine shops expanded their operations to serve customers across the new nation, while new industries emerged to process the agricultural and natural resource products flowing into Toronto from surrounding regions. The Massey Manufacturing Company, which produced agricultural implements, became one of Toronto's first major industrial success stories during this period. The growth of manufacturing transformed Toronto's social structure as thousands of industrial workers moved to the city to find employment in the expanding factories and workshops. These workers, many of them recent immigrants from Britain and Ireland, created new neighbourhoods around the industrial areas and brought different perspectives and concerns to the city's political and social life. Labour organisations began to emerge as workers sought to improve their wages and working conditions through collective action. Toronto's population growth during the Confederation era was remarkable by any measure. From approximately 56,000 residents in 1861, the city expanded to over 86,000 by 1871 and continued growing rapidly throughout the decade. This growth put enormous pressure on the city's infrastructure and public services, requiring massive investments in water supply, sewage treatment, transportation, and other essential systems. The expansion of Toronto's boundaries during this period reflected both the practical needs created by population growth and the ambitions of civic leaders who envisioned their city as a major metropolitan centre. Areas that had been separate communities, such as Yorkville and the Ward, were gradually incorporated into the expanding city, bringing new residents and resources while also creating new challenges for municipal governance. Education became an increasingly important priority as Toronto's population grew more diverse and the economy demanded workers with higher levels of skill and knowledge. The provincial government's commitment to free public education, implemented during the 1870s, meant that children from working-class families could attend school alongside those from more prosperous backgrounds. This democratization of education helped create new opportunities for social mobility while also providing the trained workforce that Toronto's expanding economy required. Higher education also expanded significantly during this period. The University of Toronto grew in size and reputation, attracting students from across Canada and establishing itself as one of the leading institutions of higher learning in North America. Professional schools for medicine, law, and engineering were established to meet the growing demand for trained professionals in these fields. The cultural life of Toronto flourished during the late 19th century as prosperity and population growth supported an increasingly sophisticated array of institutions and activities. The Royal Opera House, opened in 1874, brought world-class musical and theatrical performances to Toronto audiences, while libraries, museums, and art galleries provided educational and cultural opportunities for residents of all backgrounds. Toronto's newspapers became more numerous and influential during this period, reflecting both the growing literacy of the population and the increasing complexity of the issues facing the city and nation. Papers like the Globe and the Mail competed vigorously for readers while also shaping public opinion on important political and social questions. These publications helped create a more informed and engaged citizenry, while also contributing to the development of a distinctly Canadian perspective on national and international affairs. Religious diversity continued to expand as different immigrant communities established their own churches and institutions. While Protestant denominations remained dominant, the Catholic population grew significantly due to Irish immigration, and small but visible Jewish and other religious communities began to emerge. This religious diversity sometimes created tensions, but it also contributed to Toronto's reputation as a tolerant and inclusive city. The development of Toronto's transportation system during the 1870s and 1880s reflected both the practical needs of a growing city and the technological innovations that were transforming urban life throughout North America. Horse-drawn streetcars began operating in 1861, providing public transportation that allowed the city to expand beyond the walking distances that had previously constrained urban development. The introduction of electric streetcars in the 1890s revolutionized Toronto's transportation system and accelerated the city's geographical expansion. Neighborhoods that had been too distant for convenient access to the city center suddenly became attractive residential areas, while the improved transportation links encouraged commercial and industrial development along the streetcar routes. Toronto's harbour continued to play a crucial role in the city's economy, despite the growing importance of railway transportation. The completion of major harbour improvements during the 1880s made Toronto one of the best equipped ports on the Great Lakes, capable of handling the largest ships then in service. Grain elevators, coal docks, and other specialised facilities were built to handle the growing volume of trade passing through the port. The relationship between Toronto and its surrounding region became increasingly complex as the city grew larger and more economically dominant. Rural areas throughout central Ontario became closely integrated with Toronto's economy, shipping their agricultural products to the city's markets and purchasing manufactured goods from Toronto's factories and wholesalers. This economic integration helped drive prosperity throughout the region, while also making smaller communities increasingly dependent on Toronto's continued success. Immigration patterns during the late 19th century began to diversify as economic opportunities in Toronto attracted people from new regions and backgrounds. While British immigrants continued to form the largest group of newcomers, increasing numbers of people arrived from continental Europe, particularly Germany and Scandinavia. These new immigrants brought different skills, traditions, and perspectives that enriched Toronto's cultural life, while also creating new challenges for social integration. The expansion of Toronto's manufacturing sector during the 1880s and 1890s established the city as one of Canada's leading industrial centres. Companies like the Dominion Bridge Company and the Toronto Electric Light Company became major employers while also contributing to the development of new technologies and industrial processes. The concentration of manufacturing in Toronto created employment opportunities that continued to attract workers from across Canada and abroad. Financial services grew even more important as Toronto's economy became more complex and far-reaching. The Toronto Stock Exchange, established in 1878, provided a marketplace for trading securities and raising capital for industrial and commercial development. Toronto's banks expanded their operations throughout Canada and began to establish international connections that would eventually make the city a global financial centre. The 1880s brought new challenges as economic recession and social tensions tested Toronto's resilience and adaptability. The national policy implemented by the federal government to protect Canadian industry through high tariffs created both opportunities and problems for Toronto's manufacturers. While some industries benefited from protection against American competition, others found their costs increased by tariffs on imported raw materials and machinery. Labour relations became increasingly contentious during this period as workers organised to demand better wages and working conditions. The Knights of Labour and other early unions gained significant support among Toronto's industrial workers, leading to a series of strikes and labour disputes that attracted national attention. The most significant of these was the streetcar strike of 1886, which paralysed public transportation for several weeks and highlighted the growing tensions between workers and employers. Despite these challenges, Toronto continued to grow and develop throughout the 1880s and 1890s. The city's population reached 144,000 by 1891, making it the second largest city in Canada after Montreal. This growth was accompanied by significant improvements in public services and infrastructure, including the construction of new schools, hospitals, and public buildings that reflected Toronto's growing prosperity and civic pride. The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885 had profound effects on Toronto's development, even though the transcontinental line did not pass directly through the city. Toronto's railway connections to the CPR mainline ensured that the city would benefit from the increased trade and settlement in Western Canada, while the opening of new markets in British Columbia provided opportunities for Toronto's manufacturers and merchants. Urban planning became an increasingly important concern as Toronto's rapid growth created new challenges for municipal governance. The city hired its first professional city engineer during this period and began to develop more systematic approaches to infrastructure development and land use planning. These efforts helped Toronto avoid some of the worst problems that plagued other rapidly growing cities, though significant challenges remained. The 1890s witnessed the beginning of Toronto's transformation into a modern metropolitan centre as new technologies and urban innovations began to reshape the city's appearance and character. Electric lighting replaced gas lamps on many streets, while the first electric elevators made it possible to construct taller buildings that could accommodate more people and businesses in the downtown core. The introduction of the telephone during the 1880s revolutionized business communications and contributed to Toronto's growing role as a regional commercial and financial centre. By the 1890s, telephone service was becoming common in businesses and middle-class homes, while the expanding network of telephone lines connected Toronto with other cities across Canada and the United States. Public health improvements during this period reflected both advances in medical knowledge and the growing resources available to municipal governments. The construction of a modern water treatment and distribution system dramatically reduced the incidence of waterborne diseases, while improved sewage disposal helped make Toronto a healthier place to live and work. The emergence of professional sports during the 1890s provided new forms of entertainment, while also contributing to Toronto's growing sense of civic identity. Baseball and lacrosse teams representing Toronto competed against clubs from other cities, creating opportunities for civic pride and rivalry that helped strengthen community bonds across social and ethnic lines. Women's roles in Toronto society began to change significantly during the late 19th century as new educational and employment opportunities became available. The establishment of women's colleges and the gradual admission of women to previously male-dominated professions created possibilities that had not existed in earlier generations. Women also became increasingly active in social reform movements, working to address problems like poverty, alcohol abuse, and poor working conditions. The arts community in Toronto grew more sophisticated and influential during this period as the city's prosperity supported a wider range of cultural activities. Local artists, writers, and musicians began to gain recognition beyond Toronto, while the city attracted visiting performers and exhibitions that enhanced its reputation as a cultural centre. The establishment of the Art Museum of Toronto in 1900 marked an important milestone in the city's cultural development. As the 19th century drew to a close, Toronto had been transformed from a small colonial outpost into a major industrial and commercial centre that played a crucial role in Canada's national economy. The city's population approached 200,000, while its economic influence extended throughout central Canada and beyond. Yet this remarkable growth was only the beginning, as the new century would bring even greater changes and challenges that would test Toronto's ability to adapt and thrive in a rapidly evolving world. The dawn of the 20th century found Toronto poised on the threshold of unprecedented transformation. The city that had weathered colonial struggles, wars, and economic upheavals was about to enter an era of explosive growth that would reshape not only its physical landscape, but its very identity as a community. What happened next would establish Toronto as one of North America's great metropolitan centres, though the path forward would be neither simple nor predictable. The first decade of the new century brought changes that would have seemed almost magical to the Toronto residents of just a generation earlier. Electric street cars now hummed along tracks that extended far into what had recently been countryside, carrying workers from distant neighbourhoods to jobs in the expanding downtown core. The soft glow of electric lighting illuminated streets that had once been dark after sunset, while the growing network of telephone lines connected businesses and homes in ways that revolutionized daily life. Perhaps most dramatically, the city began to reach skyward in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. The development of steel frame construction and improved elevator technology made it possible to build structures of unprecedented height. And Toronto's business district began to sprout buildings that towered above their neighbours. These early skyscrapers, modest by later standards but revolutionary in their time, symbolised the city's growing ambitions and economic power. The Traders Bank building, completed in 1905, rose 15 stories above the intersection of Yonge and Colborne Streets, making it one of the tallest structures in the British Empire at the time. From its upper floors, visitors could see across Lake Ontario to the American shore, a vista that seemed to capture Toronto's expanding horizons and growing connections to the broader world. Other impressive buildings followed, each pushing the boundaries of what had seemed possible just years before. Toronto's population continued to surge during these boom years, reaching nearly 210,000 by 1901 and climbing steadily throughout the decade. This growth reflected not only natural increase among existing residents, but also continued immigration from Britain and an expanding flow of newcomers from continental Europe. Italian, Polish, and Jewish immigrants began to establish distinct neighbourhoods that added new flavours to Toronto's cultural mix, though not without occasional tensions and misunderstandings. The ward and area near the city centre became home to many of these newer immigrant communities. Here, families crowded into modest housing while working to establish themselves in their new country. Small businesses, ethnic restaurants, and community organisations flourished in the ward, creating a vibrant, multicultural enclave that challenged Toronto's traditional British Protestant character. The area buzzed with different languages and customs, reflecting the increasingly diverse nature of the growing city. Manufacturing continued to expand rapidly during the early 1900s, driven by both the growing domestic market and technological innovations that increased productivity and quality. The Massey Harris Company became an international success story, exporting agricultural machinery to farmers across the British Empire and establishing Toronto as a centre for advanced manufacturing. Other companies followed suit, producing everything from pianos to bicycles to electrical equipment for markets throughout Canada and beyond. The expansion of manufacturing created thousands of new jobs, but it also brought new challenges for workers and their families. Industrial accidents were common, wages were often low, and working conditions could be dangerous or unhealthy. Labour unions grew stronger during this period as workers organised to demand better treatment and fair compensation for their efforts. The early 1900s saw numerous strikes and labour disputes that reflected these growing tensions between workers and employers. One particularly significant conflict occurred in 1902 when streetcar workers went on strike for better wages and shorter hours. The strike paralysed public transportation for weeks, forcing residents to walk long distances or find alternative means of getting to work. The dispute attracted national attention and highlighted the growing power of organised labour in Toronto's increasingly industrial economy. Eventually, negotiations led to a settlement that improved conditions for the workers while allowing the streetcar system to resume normal operations. Toronto's role as a financial centre became more pronounced during this period as the city's banks expanded their operations and new financial institutions were established to serve the growing economy. The Toronto Stock Exchange moved into larger quarters to accommodate increased trading activity, while investment firms and insurance companies opened offices to serve clients throughout central Canada. This concentration of financial services helped attract other businesses to Toronto, while also providing capital for continued industrial and commercial development. The city's harbour remained crucial to its economic success, despite the growing importance of railway transportation. Massive grain elevators were constructed along the waterfront to handle the wheat and other agricultural products flowing into Toronto from the prairie provinces. Coal docks served the energy needs of the city's factories and homes, while passenger terminals welcomed the steamships that still provided important transportation links to other Great Lakes cities. However, the industrial development along the waterfront came at a cost that would not be fully appreciated for many decades. The concentration of factories, rail yards, and shipping facilities created pollution problems that affected both the harbour and the surrounding neighbourhoods. Smoke from coal-burning industries darkened the air, while industrial waste contaminated the water that had once been pristine. These environmental challenges would grow worse before they began to improve, but they represented the price of Toronto's rapid industrial growth. Education continued to be a priority for Toronto's leaders and residents, reflecting both the practical needs of an increasingly complex economy and the community's commitment to providing opportunities for advancement. New schools were built throughout the expanding city, while existing institutions were enlarged and improved to accommodate growing enrolments. The University of Toronto expanded significantly during this period, adding new faculties and research facilities that enhanced its reputation as one of Canada's leading centres of higher learning. Professional education became increasingly important as Toronto's economy demanded workers with specialised skills and knowledge. Medical schools, law schools, and engineering programs attracted students from across Canada and beyond, while also providing the trained professionals that the city's growing business community required. These educational institutions helped establish Toronto's reputation as a centre of expertise and innovation that extended far beyond its immediate geographic boundaries. Cultural life flourished during the early 1900s as Toronto's prosperity and growing population supported an increasingly sophisticated array of institutions and activities. The Royal Alexandra Theatre, opened in 1907, brought world-class dramatic and musical productions to Toronto audiences, while smaller venues provided opportunities for local performers and emerging artists. Libraries expanded their collections and services, while museums and galleries offered educational and cultural experiences that enriched the lives of residents from all backgrounds. The development of Toronto's park system during this period reflected both the practical needs of a growing urban population and changing ideas about public health and quality of life. High Park, acquired by the city in 1876, was expanded and improved with walking paths, recreational facilities, and carefully planned landscapes that provided residents with access to natural beauty and outdoor recreation. Smaller neighbourhood parks were created throughout the expanding city, offering children safe places to play and families opportunities to gather and socialise. Sports and recreation became increasingly important aspects of Toronto life during the early 1900s as residents sought entertainment and physical activity to balance the demands of urban living. Professional baseball and hockey teams representing Toronto competed against clubs from other cities, creating opportunities for civic pride and community identity that transcended social and ethnic divisions. Amateur sports clubs proliferated throughout the city, providing opportunities for people of all backgrounds to participate in organised athletic activities. The automobile began to make its appearance on Toronto streets during this period, though it remained a curiosity rather than a practical form of transportation for most residents. The first cars were expensive, unreliable, and difficult to operate, making them primarily toys for the wealthy rather than serious alternatives to streetcars or horse-drawn vehicles. However, far-sighted observers recognised that this new technology might eventually transform urban transportation and city planning in fundamental ways. Women's roles in Toronto society continued to evolve during the early 1900s as new opportunities became available in education, employment, and public life. The women's suffrage movement gained momentum as activists argued for political rights and equal treatment under the law. Organisations like the Toronto Women's Literary Club and the National Council of Women provided forums for discussion and advocacy while also working to address social problems like poverty, child welfare, and public health. The temperance movement also gained significant support during this period, particularly among women who saw alcohol abuse as a major cause of family problems and social disorder. Prohibition advocates organised rallies, distributed literature, and lobbied for legislation to restrict or eliminate the sale of alcoholic beverages. While their ultimate goal of complete prohibition would prove temporary, their efforts reflected growing concerns about the social costs of rapid urban growth and industrial development. Immigration continued to reshape Toronto's demographic composition during the early 1900s, though not without controversy and occasional conflict. While British immigrants were generally welcomed and quickly integrated into the existing social structure, newcomers from other regions sometimes faced discrimination and hostility from established residents who viewed them as threatening to traditional values and customs. Jewish immigrants, in particular, faced significant prejudice despite their contributions to the city's economic and cultural life. Many businesses and social clubs excluded Jewish members, while some neighbourhoods attempted to prevent Jewish families from purchasing homes. These discriminatory practices reflected broader patterns of anti-Semitism that were common throughout North America during this period, though they were gradually challenged by more inclusive attitudes and legal protections. Italian immigrants also encountered suspicion and stereotyping, though their numbers grew steadily, throughout the early 1900s. Many Italian families established small businesses, particularly in food service and construction, while maintaining strong community ties and cultural traditions. The annual festa celebrations and other cultural events helped preserve Italian heritage while also introducing other Toronto residents to new foods, music, and customs. The expansion of Toronto's boundaries during this period reflected both the practical needs created by population growth and the ambitions of civic leaders who envisioned their city as a major metropolitan centre. Areas that had been separate municipalities, such as North Toronto and East Toronto, were gradually incorporated into the expanding city, bringing new residents and resources while also creating new challenges for municipal governance and service delivery. Public health improvements during the early 1900s reflected both advances in medical knowledge and the growing resources available to municipal governments. The construction of new hospitals and clinics improved access to medical care, while public health campaigns addressed problems like infectious diseases, sanitation, and food safety. The establishment of the Toronto Department of Health in 1883 had already begun to address these issues systematically, and continued improvements during the new century made Toronto one of the healthiest cities in North America. The Pure Milk campaign of the early 1900s exemplified these public health efforts. Contaminated milk had been a major cause of infant mortality and childhood illness, but new regulations requiring pasteurization and improved sanitary conditions in dairy operations dramatically reduced these health risks. Similar campaigns addressed problems with water quality, food safety, and waste disposal, contributing to significant improvements in overall public health. Transportation planning became an increasingly complex challenge as Toronto's growth outpaced the capacity of existing systems. The streetcar network was expanded repeatedly to serve new neighbourhoods, while efforts were made to coordinate different transportation modes to improve efficiency and reduce congestion. The construction of new bridges and road improvements helped accommodate growing traffic, though the fundamental challenges of moving large numbers of people efficiently through an expanding urban area would require ongoing attention and innovation. The retail sector underwent significant changes during the early 1900s as new forms of commercial organisation emerged to serve Toronto's growing and increasingly prosperous population. Department stores like Eaton's and Simpson's became major downtown institutions, offering wide selections of merchandise under one roof and pioneering new techniques in advertising, customer service, and inventory management. These large stores changed shopping patterns while also providing employment for thousands of workers, particularly women who found new opportunities in sales and clerical positions. The development of Toronto's financial district accelerated during this period as banks, insurance companies, and investment firms competed to build impressive headquarters that would reflect their success and attract customers. The intersection of King and Bay Streets became the symbolic heart of Canadian finance, with new buildings designed in the latest architectural styles and equipped with the most modern technology available. Manufacturing diversity expanded significantly as entrepreneurs recognized opportunities to serve both local and national markets, with products ranging from consumer goods to industrial equipment. The Singer Sewing Machine Company, Heintzman Pianos, and many other firms established major operations in Toronto, taking advantage of the city's skilled workforce, transportation links, and access to capital. This industrial diversification helped make Toronto's economy more resilient and reduced its dependence on any single sector or market. Labour relations continued to evolve as both workers and employers adapted to the realities of industrial capitalism. The formation of the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada in 1886 had provided a national voice for organised labour and Toronto workers played important roles in this organisation's development. Collective bargaining became more common, though strikes and lockouts remained frequent as different groups struggled to define fair terms for employment in the rapidly changing economy. The early 1900s also saw the emergence of new forms of popular entertainment that reflected Toronto's growing prosperity and cultural sophistication. Vaudeville theatres, movie houses, and amusement parks provided diversions for working-class families, while more upscale venues catered to the tastes of the wealthy and middle class. These entertainment options helped create shared cultural experiences that brought together people from different backgrounds, while also providing economic opportunities for performers, entrepreneurs, and workers in the entertainment industry. Religious diversity continued to expand as different immigrant communities established their own places of worship and maintained their distinctive traditions. While Protestant denominations remained dominant numerically, the growing Catholic, Jewish, and Orthodox communities added new dimensions to Toronto's spiritual life. Occasionally, religious differences created tensions or conflicts, but generally the city's various faith communities coexisted peacefully and contributed to the broader community's charitable and educational activities. The development of Toronto's transportation infrastructure during this period laid the foundation for the city's continued expansion throughout the 20th century. Electric streetcar lines extended into previously undeveloped areas, making suburban living possible for middle-class families who could afford to commute to downtown jobs. This pattern of growth would accelerate in later decades as new transportation technologies made even more distant areas accessible for residential development. By 1910, Toronto had become unrecognisable from the modest colonial settlement that had struggled to survive just over a century earlier. The city's population approached 375,000, making it one of the largest urban centres in Canada and a significant metropolis by international standards. More importantly, Toronto had developed the economic, social, and cultural institutions that would enable it to continue growing and adapting to the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The foundations were now in place for even more dramatic changes that would transform Toronto into a truly global city. The next decade would bring a world war that would test the community's resilience, followed by periods of prosperity and depression that would reshape the urban landscape once again. Through it all, Toronto would continue to demonstrate the adaptability and determination that had characterized its development from the very beginning. The decade of the 1910s would prove to be one of the most transformative in Toronto's history, testing the city's character in ways that no previous generation had experienced. The outbreak of the First World War in August 1914 sent shockwaves through every corner of Canadian society, and Toronto, as one of the nation's largest and most influential cities, found itself thrust into a global conflict that would reshape not only the community itself but its relationship with the wider world. The initial response to the war declaration was one of overwhelming enthusiasm and patriotic fervour. Thousands of young Toronto men lined up at recruitment centres, eager to serve the British Empire in what many believed would be a brief and glorious campaign. The city's newspapers ran headlines proclaiming the righteousness of the cause, while public rallies and parades demonstrated the community's commitment to supporting the war effort. Few could have imagined that this conflict would drag on for more than 4 years and claim the lives of so many of the city's sons. Toronto's manufacturing sector quickly adapted to wartime demands, as factories that had previously produced consumer goods retooled their operations to supply munitions, uniforms, and other military supplies. The Imperial Munitions Board established major contracts with Toronto-based companies, transforming the city into one of Canada's most important centres of war production. Factories worked around the clock to meet urgent military requirements, while new facilities were constructed to expand production capacity even further. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during the war years, taking on roles that had previously been reserved for men. In munitions factories, women operated dangerous machinery and handled explosive materials, earning wages that provided new levels of economic independence. These munitionettes, as they came to be known, challenged traditional assumptions about women's capabilities while also contributing essential services to the war effort. Their experiences during the conflict would have lasting effects on discussions about women's rights and roles in society. The war also brought new challenges related to immigration and ethnic relations within the city. Toronto's substantial German community faced suspicion and hostility as anti-German sentiments swept through Canadian society. German-language newspapers were banned, German cultural organizations were disbanded, and some residents of German origin faced discrimination in employment and business. These experiences highlighted the tensions between loyalty to the British Empire and the multicultural reality of Toronto's population. Labour relations became increasingly complex during the war years as the demand for workers drove up wages, while also creating new sources of tension. The federal government's decision to introduce conscription in 1917 proved particularly controversial in Toronto, where opinion was divided between those who supported mandatory military service and those who argued that it was unfair to force men into combat. The conscription crisis strained relationships between different ethnic and religious communities, while also highlighting class divisions within the city. The influenza pandemic that struck Toronto in 1918 compounded the challenges created by the war. The deadly flu virus spread rapidly through the crowded city, overwhelming hospitals and public health services that were already strained by wartime demands. Schools, theatres and other public venues were closed in an attempt to slow the spread of the disease, while emergency measures were implemented to care for the thousands of residents who fell ill. The pandemic claimed hundreds of lives in Toronto and left lasting scars on a community already grieving for those lost in the war. Despite these challenges, Toronto emerged from the war years with enhanced status and confidence. The city's crucial role in war production had demonstrated its industrial capacity, while its financial institutions had helped fund Canada's war effort through bond drives and other fundraising activities. The successful completion of such massive undertakings proved that Toronto could mobilize resources and coordinate complex activities on a scale that rivaled much larger international cities. The 1920s brought a period of remarkable prosperity and cultural flowering that would later be remembered as Toronto's first golden age. The wartime economy had created new wealth and opportunities, while technological innovations promised to transform daily life in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. The city's population continued to grow rapidly, reaching nearly 522,000 by 1921, as people from across Canada and around the world were drawn by economic opportunities and urban amenities. The automobile revolution transformed Toronto's physical landscape and social patterns during the 1920s. What had been an expensive curiosity for the wealthy before the war became an increasingly common sight on city streets, as mass production techniques made cars more affordable for middle-class families. The Model T Ford and other popular vehicles changed how people lived and worked, making it possible to live farther from downtown, while still maintaining employment in the city centre. This automotive transformation required massive investments in new infrastructure. Streets that had been designed for horse-drawn traffic and streetcars needed to be widened and improved to accommodate growing numbers of automobiles. Traffic signals were installed at busy intersections, while parking became a new concern for downtown businesses. The city government struggled to keep pace with these rapid changes, while also addressing the ongoing needs of public transportation and pedestrian safety. The construction boom of the 1920s reshaped Toronto's skyline, and established many of the architectural landmarks that would define the city for decades to come. The Royal York Hotel, completed in 1929, was the largest hotel in the British Commonwealth when it opened, symbolising Toronto's growing importance as a destination for business travellers and tourists. Other impressive buildings followed, each pushing the boundaries of height and architectural sophistication, while also reflecting the optimism and ambition of the era. Residential development expanded rapidly during this period as new neighbourhoods were created to accommodate Toronto's growing population. Streetcar suburbs extended the city's reach into previously rural areas, while new housing styles reflected both changing family patterns and the influence of American architectural trends. The bungalow became a popular choice for middle-class families, offering modern conveniences and efficient layouts that suited contemporary lifestyles. The entertainment industry flourished during the 1920s as Toronto embraced the cultural innovations that were sweeping across North America. Jazz music found enthusiastic audiences in the city's nightclubs and dance halls, while movie theatres proliferated to meet the growing demand for Hollywood films. Radio broadcasting began during this decade, with Toronto stations reaching audiences throughout central Canada and helping to create shared cultural experiences across vast geographic distances. Prohibition, which had been implemented in Ontario during the war years, created new social tensions and opportunities during the 1920s. While many residents supported the ban on alcohol sales as a moral necessity, others viewed it as an infringement on personal freedom that created more problems than it solved. Bootlegging and illegal drinking establishments flourished despite law enforcement efforts, while the proximity of the United States, where prohibition was also in effect, created opportunities for cross-border smuggling operations. Women's roles continued to evolve during the 1920s as the experiences of the war years opened new possibilities for education, employment, and political participation. The achievement of women's suffrage in 1917 had been followed by increasing involvement in municipal politics and social reform movements. Women's organisations worked to address issues like child welfare, public health, and urban planning, while individual women began to enter professions that had previously been closed to them. The flapper phenomenon of the 1920s challenged traditional assumptions about appropriate behaviour for young women, though Toronto's relatively conservative social climate meant that such changes occurred more gradually than in larger American cities. Nevertheless, shorter skirts, bobbed hair, and more independent lifestyles became increasingly common among young Toronto women, reflecting broader changes in social attitudes and generational values. Toronto's emergence as a major centre for Canadian business and finance accelerated during the 1920s as the city's banks and investment firms expanded their operations throughout the country. The Toronto Stock Exchange experienced tremendous growth as investors sought to capitalise on the economic boom, while new financial instruments and institutions were developed to serve the increasingly complex needs of businesses and individuals. This financial expansion helped establish Toronto's dominance in Canadian capital markets, a position that would only strengthen in subsequent decades. Manufacturing continued to diversify and expand during the prosperous 1920s, with Toronto-based companies establishing themselves as leaders in emerging industries like automobile production, electrical equipment, and consumer appliances. The Ford Motor Company's decision to locate a major assembly plant in nearby Oakville brought thousands of well-paying jobs to the Toronto region, while also establishing the city as a centre for automotive manufacturing. Other companies followed suit, creating an industrial ecosystem that supported continued growth and innovation. The retail sector underwent significant changes during this period as new forms of commercial organisation emerged to serve Toronto's increasingly prosperous and sophisticated consumers. chain stores began to challenge independent merchants, while new advertising techniques and credit arrangements made it easier for families to purchase automobiles, appliances, and other consumer goods. The Eaton's catalogue became a fixture in homes throughout central Canada, while the company's downtown flagship store attracted shoppers from across the region. Cultural institutions expanded and flourished during the 1920s as Toronto's growing prosperity supported more ambitious educational and artistic endeavours. The University of Toronto continued to grow in size and reputation, while new museums, galleries and performance venues provided opportunities for both local and visiting artists. The Hart House at the University of Toronto became a particularly important centre for cultural activities, hosting concerts, exhibitions, and lectures that enriched the intellectual life of the entire community. Sports and recreation became increasingly important aspects of Toronto life during the 1920s as residents sought entertainment and physical activity to balance the demands of urban living. Professional hockey gained enormous popularity, with the Toronto St. Patrick's competing in the newly formed National Hockey League and attracting passionate support from fans throughout the city. Baseball, golf, and tennis also attracted growing audiences, while amateur sports clubs provided opportunities for participation by people of all backgrounds and skill levels. The development of Toronto's park system continued during this period as civic leaders recognised the importance of providing green space and recreational facilities for the growing urban population. The Toronto Islands were developed as a major recreational destination, offering beaches, amusement parks, and other attractions that provided escape from the increasingly crowded and polluted city centre. New parks were created throughout the expanding metropolitan area, while existing facilities were improved and expanded to meet growing demand. Public health initiatives during the 1920s reflected both advances in medical knowledge and the growing resources available to municipal governments. The construction of new hospitals and clinics improved access to medical care, while public health campaigns addressed problems like tuberculosis, infant mortality, and workplace safety. The establishment of school health programs helped ensure that children received regular medical attention, while also educating families about proper nutrition and hygiene practices. Transportation planning became an increasingly complex challenge as Toronto's growth outpaced the capacity of existing systems. The streetcar network was expanded and modernised to serve new neighbourhoods, while efforts were made to coordinate different transportation modes to improve efficiency and reduce congestion. The construction of new bridges and road improvements helped accommodate growing automobile traffic, though the fundamental challenges of moving large numbers of people efficiently through an expanding urban area would require ongoing attention and innovation. Immigration patterns during the 1920s began to shift as new federal policies restricted entry from certain regions while encouraging newcomers from preferred countries. British immigrants continued to be welcomed enthusiastically, while those from continental Europe faced various barriers and restrictions. These policies reflected prevailing attitudes about racial and ethnic hierarchies, though they also created ongoing tensions between Toronto's desire for continued growth and its commitment to maintaining particular cultural characteristics. The economic boom of the 1920s created new opportunities for social mobility while also exacerbating existing inequalities within Toronto society. Professional and managerial workers enjoyed unprecedented prosperity, while industrial workers struggled to keep pace with rising costs of living despite generally higher wages. Housing shortages became a persistent problem as population growth outstripped construction, leading to overcrowding in some neighbourhoods and speculation that drove up real estate prices. Religious life in Toronto continued to evolve during the 1920s as different denominations adapted to changing social conditions and generational attitudes. While Protestant churches remained numerically dominant, their influence on public policy and social norms began to decline as the city became more diverse and secular. Catholic, Jewish, and other religious communities established new institutions and gained greater acceptance, though prejudice and discrimination remained significant problems. The media landscape expanded dramatically during the 1920s as new technologies and business models created unprecedented opportunities for information and entertainment. Radio broadcasting revolutionized how people received news and enjoyed music, while Toronto stations began to develop distinctive programming that reflected local interests and tastes. Newspapers remained important sources of information and opinion, though they faced new competition from radio and struggled to adapt to changing reader preferences. Urban planning began to emerge as a professional discipline during this period as Toronto's leaders recognized the need for more systematic approaches to managing growth and development. The City Planning Board, established in 1919, began to develop comprehensive plans for future development while also addressing immediate problems like traffic congestion and inadequate housing. These early planning efforts laid the foundation for more sophisticated approaches that would be implemented in later decades. The stock market crash of October 1929 brought Toronto's prosperous decade to a sudden and dramatic end. The collapse of stock prices wiped out millions of dollars in wealth, while also triggering a broader economic depression that would test the city's resilience in ways that even the First World War had not. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared as the economic boom of the 1920s gave way to the grinding hardship of the 1930s. Once again, Toronto would need to demonstrate its ability to adapt and survive in the face of unprecedented challenges. The Great Depression struck Toronto with devastating force, transforming the prosperous metropolis of the 1920s into a city struggling to maintain basic services and care for its most vulnerable residents. Unemployment soared to levels that would have been unimaginable just months earlier, as factories closed their doors and construction projects ground to a halt. By 1933, nearly one-third of Toronto's workforce was without steady employment, while countless others survived on reduced hours and diminished wages. The human cost of the economic collapse was visible throughout the city. Bread lines formed outside churches and charitable organizations, while families who had enjoyed middle-class comfort found themselves unable to pay rent or purchase adequate food. The proud industrial workers who'd built Toronto's prosperity during the previous decade now faced the humiliation of accepting relief payments or seeking temporary work wherever it could be found. Many residents left the city entirely, returning to rural areas where they hoped to find sustenance through farming or family connections. Municipal finances came under enormous strain as the city struggled to provide relief for unemployed residents, while also maintaining essential services. Property tax revenues declined as businesses failed and homeowners defaulted on payments, while the demand for social services increased dramatically. The city government was forced to implement severe budget cuts, reducing expenditures on parks, libraries, and other amenities that had been sources of civic pride during more prosperous times. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Toronto's community organizations and religious institutions mobilized to provide assistance for those most in need. Soup kitchens operated throughout the city, while volunteer groups organized clothing drives and emergency shelter programs. The United Church, Catholic parishes, and Jewish congregations worked together across denominational lines to address the immediate needs of hungry and homeless residents. These collaborative efforts helped maintain social cohesion during a period when many cities experienced significant unrest and political upheaval. The federal government's response to the Depression included various work programs designed to provide employment, while also completing useful public projects. In Toronto, these programs funded the construction of new parks, public buildings, and infrastructure improvements that might not have been possible during normal economic conditions. The Gardner Expressway planning began during this period, though construction would not commence until after the Second World War. These projects provided crucial employment while also contributing to the city's long-term development. Labour relations underwent significant changes during the Depression years as workers organised more effectively to protect their interests and advocate for better conditions. The formation of industrial unions that included all workers in particular industries, rather than just skilled craftsmen, represented a major shift in how labour organised itself. These new unions were often more militant and politically active than their predecessors, leading to strikes and confrontations that sometimes required government intervention. Women's employment patterns changed dramatically during the Depression as economic necessity forced many families to reconsider traditional gender roles. While some women lost jobs in industries that were considered primarily male domains, others found new opportunities in service sectors that continued to operate despite the economic downturn. The financial pressures faced by many families meant that women's contributions to household income became more essential, gradually shifting attitudes about women's roles in the workforce. The entertainment industry adapted creatively to the economic constraints of the Depression era. Movie theatres offered affordable escapism for families struggling with daily hardships, while radio programming provided free entertainment that could reach audiences regardless of their economic circumstances. Local theatrical groups and musical organisations found new audiences among residents who could no longer afford more expensive forms of entertainment. These cultural activities helped maintain community morale during the darkest years of the economic crisis. Immigration virtually ceased during the early 1930s as Canada implemented restrictive policies designed to protect employment opportunities for existing residents. The flow of newcomers that had sustained Toronto's growth for decades was reduced to a trickle, fundamentally altering the city's demographic patterns. Some immigrants who had arrived during the 1920s chose to return to their countries of origin, believing that opportunities might be better elsewhere. This reduction in population growth relieved some pressure on housing and services, though it also reduced the dynamism that immigration had traditionally brought to the city. Urban development slowed dramatically as private investment dried up and municipal governments lacked resources for major infrastructure projects. Construction of new housing virtually stopped, while maintenance of existing buildings was deferred due to financial constraints. Some neighbourhoods that had been thriving commercial districts began to show signs of decay as businesses failed and property owners lacked resources for upkeep. The physical appearance of the city began to reflect the economic hardships that residents were experiencing. Educational institutions faced severe budget pressures during the Depression, though they also played important roles in helping residents adapt to changing economic conditions. Schools implemented cost-cutting measures while also expanding programs designed to provide practical skills for unemployed adults. The University of Toronto reduced faculty positions and eliminated some programs, though it also began to develop new approaches to research and public service that would prove valuable in later decades. Public health initiatives continued despite financial constraints, as civic leaders recognized that economic hardship could easily lead to health crises that would compound existing problems. Free medical clinics expanded their services, while public health campaigns addressed issues like malnutrition and inadequate housing that became more prevalent during the Depression. The city's hospital system struggled to provide care for increasing numbers of patients who could not afford private medical treatment. The political landscape shifted significantly during the Depression years as traditional political parties struggled to address unprecedented economic challenges. New political movements emerged that advocated for more radical solutions to unemployment and poverty, while established politicians found their credibility undermined by their inability to restore prosperity. Municipal elections became contests between different approaches to managing the crisis, with some candidates advocating for increased government intervention, while others argued for reduced spending and lower taxes. Religious communities played increasingly important roles in providing both material assistance and spiritual comfort during the difficult years of the Depression. Churches of all denominations expanded their charitable activities while also grappling with theological questions about suffering, justice, and the proper relationship between faith and economic systems. Some religious leaders became advocates for social reform, arguing that the economic crisis demonstrated the need for fundamental changes in how society was organized. The retail sector underwent significant consolidation during the Depression, as smaller businesses failed and larger companies absorbed their market share. Department stores like Eaton's and Simpson's maintained their operations by reducing staff and inventory, while also adapting their merchandise and marketing strategies to appeal to customers with limited spending power. The growth of chain stores accelerated during this period, as these businesses could often operate more efficiently than independent merchants. Transportation systems faced unique challenges during the Depression, as ridership declined due to unemployment and reduced economic activity. The Toronto Transportation Commission implemented service cuts and fare increases to maintain financial viability, while also exploring new technologies and operating procedures that could reduce costs. The streetcar system continued to serve as the backbone of public transit, though discussions about alternative transportation modes became more serious as planners looked toward future recovery. Manufacturing industries that survived the early years of the Depression often emerged stronger and more efficient than their predecessors. Companies that could maintain operations during the crisis implemented new production techniques and labour practices that increased productivity while reducing costs. These improvements positioned Toronto's industrial sector to take advantage of opportunities when economic conditions began to improve later in the decade. The banking and financial sector in Toronto weathered the Depression better than similar institutions in many other cities, partly due to more conservative lending practices and stronger regulatory oversight. However, the collapse of several smaller financial institutions and the broader loss of confidence in economic systems led to significant changes in how banks operated and how they were regulated. These changes would have lasting effects on Toronto's role as a financial centre. Cultural institutions struggled to maintain operations during the Depression, though many found creative ways to continue serving the community despite reduced budgets. Museums offered free admission days and educational programs, while libraries became important gathering places for unemployed residents who needed access to information and social contact. These institutions helped maintain the intellectual and cultural life of the city even during the most difficult economic periods. Urban planning efforts continued during the Depression, though with different priorities and constraints than had existed during more prosperous times. Planners focused on addressing immediate problems like inadequate housing and traffic congestion, while also beginning to envision how the city might develop when economic conditions improved. The challenges of the Depression highlighted the importance of systematic planning and coordination between different levels of government. Housing conditions deteriorated in many neighbourhoods during the Depression as families doubled up to share expenses and property owners deferred maintenance due to financial constraints. Some areas that had been respectable working-class neighbourhoods began to show signs of overcrowding and neglect, while the lack of new construction meant that housing shortages persisted even as population growth slowed. These problems would require significant attention when economic recovery eventually began. The media landscape evolved during the Depression as newspapers and radio stations adapted to serve audiences facing unprecedented challenges. News coverage focused increasingly on local economic conditions and government relief programs, while entertainment programming provided escape from daily hardships. Radio became particularly important as a source of both information and free entertainment for families who could no longer afford many other forms of recreation. Sports and recreation continued to play important roles in community life during the Depression, though often in modified forms that reflected economic realities. Professional sports teams struggled with reduced attendance and sponsorship, while amateur organisations found creative ways to maintain activities despite limited resources. Parks and public recreation facilities became even more important as families sought inexpensive ways to spend leisure time and maintain physical fitness. By the mid-1930s, signs of economic recovery began to appear as government spending programs took effect and international trade slowly resumed. New construction projects provided employment for workers who had been idle for years, while businesses that had survived the worst of the crisis began to expand their operations cautiously. The psychological impact of these improvements was as important as the economic benefits, as residents began to believe that better times might actually return. The approach of the Second World War created new demands for Canadian industry and resources, providing additional stimulus for Toronto's economic recovery. Even before Canada officially entered the conflict, British orders for military supplies began to revive the city's manufacturing sector and provide employment for workers who had been struggling to find steady work. The transition from Depression to wartime production would prove to be another dramatic transformation in Toronto's ongoing evolution. However, the lessons learned during the Depression years would have lasting effects on how Toronto approached future challenges. The experience of widespread unemployment and economic hardship led to new ideas about the role of government in ensuring economic stability and social welfare. Labour organisations that had been strengthened during the crisis would continue to play important roles in shaping working conditions and political debates. Most importantly, the community solidarity that had helped Toronto survive its darkest economic period would provide a foundation for addressing the new challenges that lay ahead. The Second World War, which began for Canada in September 1939, would once again transform Toronto from a city still recovering from economic crisis into a major centre of wartime production and activity. Unlike the previous global conflict, this war would be longer, more demanding, and more transformative in its effects on both the city and the broader society. The Toronto that emerged from 6 years of total war would be fundamentally different from the community that had struggled through the Depression, setting the stage for unprecedented growth and change in the post-war era. The transformation of Toronto during the Second World War was nothing short of extraordinary. Within months of Canada's declaration of war, the city's factories were humming with activity that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of the Depression. Aircraft manufacturing plants sprouted across the metropolitan area, while shipyards along the waterfront worked around the clock to produce vessels for the Royal Canadian Navy. The sound of riveting guns and industrial machinery replaced the silence that had characterized so many neighborhoods just years before. Victory Aircraft Limited established a massive facility in nearby Moulton, employing thousands of workers who produced Lancaster bombers for the Royal Air Force. These heavy aircraft, assembled by hands that had recently been idle, would carry Canadian aircrews on dangerous missions over occupied Europe. The sight of completed bombers taking their first flights became a symbol of Toronto's contribution to the Allied war effort, while also demonstrating the remarkable capacity for industrial mobilization that the city had developed over decades of growth. From ancient Indigenous fishing weirs to the gleaming towers of today's financial district, Toronto's journey spans millennia of continuous transformation. Through wars, economic upheavals, waves of immigration, and countless challenges, this remarkable city has demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for reinvention while maintaining its essential character as a crossroads of cultures and commerce. Whatever changes lie ahead, Toronto's story reminds us that great cities are built not just from steel and stone, but from the resilience and dreams of the people who call them home.